This comprehensive training package will enable supervisors to meet the requirements for reasonable suspicion training. Reasonable suspicion testing is not only important, but it is arguably the most important element of the entire DOT drug and alcohol testing program. After completing this training, you will be able to make reasonable suspicion determinations confidently and correctly. All DOT operating agencies require some form of reasonable suspicion training. Although the training requirements are similar, the focus of this training is on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration requirements. The differences between PHMSA regulations and the other DOT operating agency regulations are noted in Appendix A in the workbook. It's important for you to be aware of the training requirements specific to your operating agency, or you may not be in compliance with the DOT regulations. For example, the FRA, or Federal Railroad Administration, requires reasonable suspicion training to be combined with post-accident training. If you're not already familiar with the PHMSA guidelines for drug and alcohol testing, you should view our Guide to the DOT Drug and Alcohol Testing Program training video as a prerequisite to reasonable suspicion training. Information on this separate video is included in your training package. PHMSA requires a minimum of 60 minutes of reasonable suspicion alcohol training and 60 minutes of reasonable suspicion drug training. However, we strongly recommend you exceed these minimum requirements. This first video in this 2-video series meets the PHMSA requirements for supervisor reasonable suspicion alcohol training and will include the physical, behavioral, speech, and performance indicators of probable alcohol misuse. The second video meets the PHMSA requirements for supervisor reasonable suspicion controlled substances training. For the purpose of this training, we will refer to controlled substances as drugs. To meet the reasonable suspicion requirements for alcohol, you will need to watch this video and use the workbook. Keep in mind, the workbook is an integral part of this training. The workbook can be used as a reference source for specific questions or issues involving reasonable suspicion when they arise. And you can even use the workbook as a guide when you're in the process of making a reasonable suspicion determination. We recommend you add an interactive component to this training by using the workbook in conjunction with this video and by discussing reasonable suspicion with another trained supervisor. By discussing reasonable suspicion with another trained supervisor, you may be able to gain additional, valuable insight into reasonable suspicion testing. Perhaps hear of another supervisor's personal experience with the subject, or get answers to further questions you may have. There are a number of what-if scenarios presented at the end of this video. The workbook contains discussions of these scenarios, which will provide a useful format to learn about the process of reasonable suspicion testing. The forms included in this training package are used to document all the phases of reasonable suspicion, from initial observation to actual testing. And the certificate documents your completion of reasonable suspicion training. The importance of reasonable suspicion testing can't be emphasized enough. The supervisor is the first line of defense to protect employees and the public at large if a driver is impaired. This training will prepare you for that important role. Now that you have an idea of what this reasonable suspicion training will entail, let's take a quick look at the contents of this first video. In this video, you will learn who is required to complete reasonable suspicion training and others who would benefit. Why reasonable suspicion testing for alcohol is so important. The role of the supervisor and the observations a supervisor needs to make for reasonable suspicion testing. How to recognize the physical, behavioral, speech, and performance indicators of probable alcohol misuse. When reasonable suspicion alcohol testing should be conducted, and how reasonable suspicion alcohol testing should be conducted. You will also learn how to use the workbook as a reference source and as a guide when making reasonable suspicion observations or determinations, and how to complete the proper documentation for reasonable suspicion testing. Additionally, the what-if scenarios will provide you with good practice for making those determinations. In Section 1, we will discuss who is required to complete reasonable suspicion training and others who would benefit from this training. Part 382.603 of the PHMSA regulations states that each employer shall ensure that all persons designated to supervise drivers receive at least 60 minutes of training on alcohol misuse and an additional 60 minutes of training on drug use. It is not acceptable to train only some of your supervisors. For the other DOT operating agencies, all persons designated to make reasonable suspicion determinations are required to receive at least 60 minutes of training on alcohol misuse and/or an additional 60 minutes of training on drug use. Refer to Appendix A in the workbook for the specific requirements for each operating agency. This training can also be used by non-safety sensitive supervisors. The DOT guidelines are conservative and supportable. Therefore, employers may choose to implement them for a drug-free workplace program that includes reasonable suspicion testing. For this purpose, we recommend all supervisors view this training. Please refer to Appendix B in the workbook for more information on drug-free workplace programs. It may also be a good idea to invite union representatives to view this training so they can become familiar with the DOT guidelines and be in a better position to answer the questions of their members. In Section 2, we will discuss why reasonable suspicion alcohol testing is more effective than random alcohol testing in detecting alcohol misuse. We will also discuss recent headlines involving reasonable suspicion and why a supervisor must test an employee when the indicators of probable alcohol misuse are apparent. An employee is subject to alcohol testing when the individual is performing, about to perform, or has just finished performing safety-sensitive functions. This includes an employee who is immediately available to perform a safety-sensitive function, such as a dispatcher or supervisor who is on call to drive even though it is not part of his or her regular job function. As a supervisor, the burden of protecting everyone on the road lies with you. Failure to conduct reasonable suspicion testing when the signs and symptoms exist puts the public at risk and could result in tragedy. As we mentioned in the beginning, reasonable suspicion testing is arguably the most important part of the DOT drug and alcohol testing program. With the minimum requirement for random alcohol testing being just 10% per year, an employee's chance of being tested randomly is only about once every 10 years. Think about it. An employee could have a serious drinking problem and be putting the public at risk for, on average, more than a decade before the likelihood of being randomly tested presents itself. This means that the reasonable suspicion test is key to finding alcohol problems. Due to this low rate of selection for random testing, some alcohol abusers sadly end up on duty while impaired. Recently, 2 pilots from a major commercial airline were arrested and had their licenses revoked after testing positive for alcohol. While the public was not injured because of the responsible actions of airport officials, this is a good example of why reasonable suspicion testing is so important. Also remember how quickly alcohol leaves an individual's system. The metabolic rate is roughly 1 drink, or 0.02 AC an hour. Theoretically, an employee could consume alcohol on the job, and if a test isn't administered in a timely manner, there is a decreasing likelihood the employee would test positive for alcohol. One of the worst accidents to date involving suspected alcohol impairment is the Exxon Valdez accident. This accident caused catastrophic damage costing $15 billion. The company was also imposed the largest fine ever for environmental crime and is still settling claims to this day. Even when an alcohol-related incident occurs on a smaller scale, everyone involved, both employers and employees, suffers. Some costs are obvious, such as increased absences, accidents, and errors. Other costs are less obvious, yet equally costly. These include lowered morale and higher illness rates. The following statistics, which have been obtained from a variety of sources, should give supervisors a wake-up call. A national household survey on drug abuse found that alcohol is the most widely abused drug among working adults. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reports that alcohol and drug abuse costs businesses roughly $81 billion in lost productivity a year, 86% of which can be attributed to alcohol abuse. Supervisors should and must conduct reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. How would you feel if one of your employees was killed or killed others in an accident? Now, how would you feel knowing you could have prevented the accident by not looking the other way when you observed the employee exhibiting indicators of probable alcohol misuse before he or she got behind the wheel? In Section 3, we will discuss the important role the supervisor plays in preventing alcohol-related tragedies and the observations a supervisor needs to make in order to conduct reasonable suspicion testing. In Section 3, we will also discuss the common fears supervisors face when considering reasonable suspicion testing. A supervisor has a wide variety of responsibilities. One key responsibility is to always be on the watch for and to recognize the signs of probable alcohol misuse. The supervisor must act as the first line of defense to protect other employees and public safety if an employee becomes impaired. Keep in mind, there are prohibited conduct events such as alcohol possession which do not require reasonable suspicion testing. We will explain these events in detail in Section 5, but it's important to note that if no impairment indicators exist, you do not need to test. Another reason a supervisor must conduct reasonable suspicion alcohol testing, aside from protecting employees and the public, is because Part 382.307 of the PHMSA regulations states so. If a supervisor does not comply with these regulations, the supervisor is subject to civil and criminal penalties. To comply with Part 382.307 of the PHMSA regulations, a supervisor should have a reasonable suspicion test conducted when the supervisor believes the employee to be impaired by alcohol. The employer's determination that reasonable suspicion exists to require the driver to undergo an alcohol test must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations relating to the employee's appearance, behavior, speech, or body odors. Slurred words, staggering, smells like beer, are examples of a specific observation. Specific observations can be explicit, meaning clear, stated in detail, and not implied, such as his speech is slurred, or definite, meaning exact or precise, such as his breath smells like beer. Contemporaneous means right now, not yesterday or last week. He just fell out of the truck and is about to drive hazardous materials across the country is an example of a contemporaneous observation. He fell out of the truck yesterday is not contemporaneous. Remember, however, for alcohol testing, even if you have a contemporaneous observation, you cannot conduct testing unless the individual is performing, about to perform, or has just finished performing safety-sensitive functions. This also applies to employees who are on duty and available to perform safety-sensitive functions. If an employee is immediately available to perform safety-sensitive functions while on duty, even if the employee's primary function is not safety-sensitive, the individual is subject to reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. It's important to note that a driver does not have to be driving in order to be subject to a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. Articulable means the observations can be put into words. I can't tell, but I think he's acting funny is not an articulable observation. He's acting funny because he keeps falling out of the truck is an articulable observation. Employees who perform safety-sensitive functions are held to a high standard. These individuals have mandatory DOT consequences with alcohol concentrations as low as 0.02, the level most individuals reach after just one drink. At the 0.02 level, an individual's probability of having an accident begins to increase, and therefore he or she has to be immediately removed from performing safety-sensitive functions. Keep in mind, alcohol is the number one substance found in drivers of commercial motor vehicles in fatal accidents. While it's generally not hard to recognize when an employee is under the influence of large amounts of alcohol, this training will help you recognize when an employee is under the influence of even a small amount of alcohol. Small amounts of alcohol can still cause impairment and can lead to a potentially dangerous situation. Remember, you're looking for levels as low as 0.02, not the much higher 0.08 to 0.10 levels that police look for. A supervisor is responsible for providing a safe working environment, and that means being alert and attentive. 1 in 5 workers report they have to work harder, redo work, cover for a coworker, or have been put in danger or injured as a result of another employee's drinking. While it's your job to protect public safety and watch for potentially dangerous situations, a supervisor must also respect the privacy of employees. Never accuse an employee of anything or talk about your concerns with anyone other than the employee or another trained supervisor. Supervisors must not let fear of confrontation deter them from performing their duty. As a supervisor, you must attempt to have reasonable suspicion testing conducted on an employee who you observe to be impaired. You need to ask yourself, if I look the other way, could I live with myself if a tragedy occurred? Although it's a difficult position to put yourself in, you must, as part of your job as a supervisor, confront an employee whom you suspect of being impaired by alcohol. If you don't test, you can find yourself in a far more difficult position. The reason why reasonable suspicion testing is the most viable test type in detecting alcohol misuse in the workplace is because if an employee is being sent for this type of test, sufficient indicators based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations already exist. Therefore, the possibility for alcohol detection is likely. In addition, the regulations support your decision to test. It cannot be stressed enough that all you need is a reasonable suspicion of probable alcohol misuse to justify your actions. If you follow this training, you will be able to recognize the indicators of alcohol misuse and possibly be able to prevent a dangerous situation from happening. In Section 4, we will define short and long-term indicators of probable alcohol misuse. We will also discuss which indicators cannot be used for the purpose of reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. Short-term indicators of alcohol misuse relate to an employee's physical appearance, behavior, speech, and performance. Short-term indicators must exist for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing to be ordered. Short-term physical indicators relate to an employee's bodily actions. If an employee is impaired by alcohol, the employee will likely exhibit physical indicators such as impaired balance, lack of muscle coordination, alcoholic body odors, and glassy eyes. Short-term behavioral indicators relate to an employee's conduct and the way an employee acts. If an employee is impaired by alcohol, the employee will likely exhibit behavioral indicators such as a lack of awareness, moodiness, depression, and combative behavior. Short-term speech indicators relate to what and how the employee is speaking, an employee's words, language, and enunciation. If an employee is impaired by alcohol, the employee will likely exhibit speech indicators such as slurred words or over-enunciation. Short-term performance indicators relate to what an employee does at work and the quantity and quality of the work the employee does. If an employee is impaired by alcohol, the employee will likely exhibit performance indicators such as putting others or themselves at great risk. Not all indicators apply to all alcohol-related instances. For example, vodka does not generally produce a strong odor, so you could have an employee who is impaired by alcohol who does not exhibit a body odor indicator. A supervisor does not need to have every indicator in place to conduct reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. If short-term indicators exist and you believe the employee is impaired by alcohol, you must remove the employee from safety-sensitive functions and immediately follow the procedures for conducting reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. While long-term indicators can't be used as a sole basis for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing because they're not contemporaneous, happening here and now, they are important because they can assist a supervisor in making the proper decision. If a supervisor keeps a record of an employee's actions and activities over time, it will be much easier for the supervisor to distinguish between an employee who is just having a bad day and an employee whose behavior has been in rapid decline. Long-term indicators should alert a supervisor to watch out for short-term indicators, which are contemporaneous and can be used to make a reasonable suspicion determination. Long-term indicators include quantity and quality of work issues over time. These include refusals to do assigned tasks, an increase in errors, reduced quantity of work, inconsistent quality of work, behavior that disrupts the workflow, excessive absences, frequent unexplained disappearances, and your growing concern over safety-sensitive offenses with the employee. Interpersonal work relationship issues are also long-term indicators. These include significant changes in relations with coworkers, frequent or intense arguments, intentional avoidance or defiance, expressions of frustrations or discontent, cynical or distrustful of human nature comments, and unusual sensitivity to advice or work critiques. Personal issues also become apparent in long-term alcohol abusers and include changes in or unusual topics of conversation, persistently boisterous or rambunctious behavior, unreliable or false statements, unrealistic self-appraisals or grandiose statements, temper tantrums or outbursts, secretive behavior, engaging in detailed discussions about death, suicide, or harming others, memory problems, and excessive fatigue. There are other indicators, no matter how convincing or telling they are, which cannot be used to make a DOT reasonable suspicion determination. These include hearsay. For example, so-and-so told me that Joe drinks on the job does not constitute grounds for a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. Rumor. For example, I heard some employees talking about how much Joe drinks. They said he uses drugs too. This also does not constitute grounds for a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. If a supervisor receives hearsay information or rumor, the supervisor cannot order a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. The supervisor needs to make reasonable suspicion observations firsthand and at the time the employee is performing safety-sensitive functions. However, just like with long-term indicators, a supervisor can document hearsay and rumor information to focus the supervisor's attention on the employee at risk. Again, if a supervisor is informed that an employee has abused alcohol at a prior time, the supervisor should be on alert for the signs of probable alcohol misuse by the employee. But the supervisor cannot order a reasonable suspicion alcohol test because the incident is not contemporaneous and because he or she did not make the observation. Or, if there is an immediate situation involving a safety-sensitive employee who another employee has witnessed appearing impaired, you should immediately go and observe the safety-sensitive employee for yourself. Once you make a specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observation firsthand, you can make a reasonable suspicion determination. In Section 5, we will discuss when a supervisor needs to send an employee for an alcohol test, a drug test, or both, and when not to test. As we previously mentioned, a supervisor must have a reasonable suspicion alcohol test conducted when the supervisor believes an employee is impaired by alcohol. The supervisor's findings must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations that relate to the employee's appearance, behavior, speech, or body odors. One criteria for reasonable suspicion testing for drugs, which is not a criteria for reasonable suspicion testing for alcohol, is seeing indicators of chronic and withdrawal effects. Chronic and withdrawal effects cannot be used for alcohol determinations since alcohol is a legal substance and can be used during non-working hours. Drugs, on the other hand, are prohibited anytime, even during non-work hours. You should test for both alcohol and drugs only when you have a reasonable suspicion of impairment and the indicators do not discount either alcohol or drugs. You do not need to test at all when an employee is exhibiting prohibited conduct, yet the conduct doesn't meet the criteria for reasonable suspicion testing. Prohibited conduct is a separate issue from reasonable suspicion. Alcohol possession is not in and of itself a violation of the PHMSA Part 382 regulations, but is prohibited conduct under Part 392.5. You cannot order a reasonable suspicion alcohol test if an employee is in possession of alcohol but has not consumed the alcohol, or you have not witnessed or observed anything to suggest the employee has consumed alcohol. Witnessed alcohol use is also a separate prohibition under both Part 382 and Part 392.5. You do not have to order a reasonable suspicion test when you witness an employee consuming alcohol. You must immediately remove the employee from performing safety-sensitive functions. While these examples are not considered violations in regards to reasonable suspicion, PHMSA addresses alcohol possession and alcohol consumption prohibitions separately. In Section 6, we will discuss the 6 steps a supervisor needs to take during the reasonable suspicion alcohol testing process. We will also discuss the additional steps a supervisor must take to ensure testing is conducted properly. A supervisor needs to be trained, have the appropriate forms and important telephone numbers readily available, and know where the testing sites are located, including any emergency after-hours sites. Use the collection site information log in the workbook to document your collection site information. Reminder: the supervisor's findings must be based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations relating to the employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. PHMSA regulations only require one supervisor for a reasonable suspicion determination. However, whenever practicable, we recommend you substantiate your findings with another trained supervisor. A second supervisor creates greater objectivity, provides additional observation, and generally strengthens the reliability of a reasonable suspicion determination. For example, an employee can claim you have a grudge against them. With another supervisor involved, the question of you picking on an employee can be dispelled. Some operating agencies require two supervisors for making a reasonable suspicion determination. Please refer to Appendix A in the workbook to find out which ones. Using the reasonable suspicion recording form in the workbook, a supervisor must document the observations leading to the reasonable suspicion alcohol test. Record only the facts and not your interpretation of the facts. The documentation should be detailed, specific, and factual. Documentation must be completed within 24 hours of the observed behavior or before the test results are released, whichever comes first. We recommend you complete the documentation as soon as possible so you don't forget any important details. Keep in mind, you may be asked to explain your actions at a later date. Don't, however, delay the testing in order to complete documentation. Documentation must be kept in your employer's confidential drug and alcohol testing files. Employers must maintain all documentation generated in connection with decisions to administer reasonable suspicion alcohol tests. When you confront an employee whom you suspect to be impaired by alcohol, do not accuse the employee of being an alcoholic. You must also protect the employee's privacy. Take the employee to a private and confidential area and base the confrontation solely on the documentation you have compiled. Tell the employee the purpose of the reasonable suspicion test is to confirm the employee's ability to perform safety-sensitive functions. Do not attempt to get a confession, but document one if it's offered. When you confront an employee based on your reasonable suspicion findings, you should expect anger, denial, excuses, apologies, promises, self-pity, and tears. You should not let these reactions change your mind. No matter how sorry the employee is still a risk to him or herself, coworkers, and the public. You'll need to call the testing site ahead of time to ensure a bat is on hand, and that testing equipment is available on which a confirmatory test can be performed. If one is not available, you have to look for another site. There are other actions which need to be taken in expediting the reasonable suspicion testing process, which include arranging transportation both to and from the testing site. Consider disciplinary action if the employee refuses transport, or call the police if you feel the employee is intoxicated and will endanger others on the road. Ensure testing is completed in a timely manner, keeping in mind that alcohol metabolizes very quickly. For example, the average 180-pound man can metabolize alcohol at a rate of approximately 1 drink per hour. Realistically, an individual can consume alcoholic beverages in the morning and pass an alcohol test with flying colors by the afternoon. It's essential to conduct testing quickly. If 2 hours pass from the time you made the initial determination to test and testing has not been completed, you must document this fact and the reasons why. Use the failure to complete testing form in the workbook and keep this report on file. If 8 hours pass and testing still has not been completed, you must discontinue the testing process. Again, complete documentation using the failure to complete testing form. This second record must also be kept on file. In the event the test comes back negative, but you still feel there is something wrong with the employee, you may decide to send the employee for a medical evaluation. Some cases have been reported in which a driver was exhibiting signs similar to those of probable alcohol misuse. After the driver was sent for a medical review, the driver was found to be suffering from diabetic symptoms such as low blood sugar. If an alcohol test comes back negative, but you still feel a driver may not be safe performing safety-sensitive functions, you may want to consider a medical evaluation. Part 382 imposes some additional requirements. No employer shall take any action against a driver based solely on the driver's behavior and appearance with respect to alcohol use in the absence of an alcohol test. This does not prohibit an employer with independent authority from taking any action otherwise consistent with the law. In addition, notwithstanding the absence of a reasonable suspicion alcohol test, Once the employer has made a reasonable suspicion determination, the employer shall not permit the safety-sensitive employee to perform safety-sensitive duties until an alcohol test is administered with a result less than 0.02 or a period of 24 hours has elapsed since the determination to test was made, whichever comes first. Another important thing to note: the supervisor who makes the reasonable suspicion determination may not perform the test. When conducting reasonable suspicion testing, supervisors should always ask themselves: 1. Am I being objective? Are my findings based on specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations? 2. Would my decision be less responsible if I did not send the employee for a reasonable suspicion alcohol test? And 3. Would another supervisor agree with my decision? If you can answer yes to all three questions, then you should proceed with the reasonable suspicion testing process. Let's take a moment to review the key points we covered in sections 1 through 6. In section 1, you learned who is required to complete reasonable suspicion training and others who would benefit from this training. These include supervisors of safety-sensitive employees, supervisors of non-safety sensitive employees, and union representatives. In section 2, you learned when an employee is subject to alcohol testing and that reasonable suspicion alcohol testing is more effective in detecting alcohol misuse than random alcohol testing. Due to the low selection rate of drivers and the speed at which alcohol is metabolized, random detection rates for alcohol are almost non-existent. You also learned about the tragic consequences that can result if you don't test. And you learned that not only do supervisors have a moral obligation to conduct reasonable suspicion testing, it's also a regulatory requirement. In section 3, you learned that a supervisor is the first line of defense. The supervisor needs to watch for and recognize indicators of alcohol misuse. These indicators include specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations based on an employee's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. You also learn that supervisors need to be aware of alcohol levels as low as 0.02% AC. You should not be on a witch hunt or try to be an alcohol expert. And do not let fear prevent you from conducting a reasonable suspicion test. In section 4, you learned about the effects of alcohol on the individual, in addition to what short-term and long-term indicators to look for and what indicators cannot be used. Short-term indicators must be in place to make a reasonable suspicion determination to conduct testing, but long-term indicators can help you make the right decision. If no short-term indicators exist, or your information is based on hearsay or rumor, you cannot conduct a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. In section 5, you learned what observations need to be in place to conduct alcohol testing. If your observations are specific, contemporaneous, and articulable, based on an employee's appearance, behavior, speech, or body odor, and you properly follow the procedures in the training, you will be in compliance with PHMSA regulations. Chronic and withdrawal effects cannot be taken into account for alcohol since alcohol is legal. However, chronic and withdrawal effects can be used when making a reasonable suspicion determination about drugs. Drugs are illegal anytime, even on weekends or after work hours. When you have reasonable suspicion, but cannot distinguish between probable alcohol misuse or drug use, you should test for both. Finally, in section 5, you learn that alcohol possession and alcohol consumption are not grounds for conducting a reasonable suspicion test. You should remove the employee immediately from performing safety-sensitive functions and refer to your employer's policy. In section 6, you learn the 6 steps in the reasonable suspicion testing process: prepare, observe, confirm, document, confront, and conduct. You also learned what other actions need to be taken to conduct reasonable suspicion testing properly. A supervisor must provide transportation for the employee, call the testing site ahead of time to ensure a breath alcohol technician is on hand, and ensure the testing is completed in a timely manner. Although it's not required by regulation, it's important for supervisors to undergo retraining over time to remain comfortable making reasonable suspicion determinations. Reasonable suspicion is foundational to the DOT alcohol and drug testing program. Sending an employee for a reasonable suspicion test is one of the most important decisions you may ever make. Remember, you share the road with these drivers too. You can use your workbook as a reference source for reviewing reasonable suspicion and as a guide when making a reasonable suspicion observation or determination. Each of the sections covered in this video is broken down into detail in the workbook, which is complete with an index, so you can quickly find the information you're looking for. You'll also find definitions for FEMSCA and DOT terms in the glossary, and answers to frequently asked questions about reasonable suspicion in the frequently asked questions section. Appendix A will detail the reasonable suspicion testing and training requirements specific to each DOT operating agency, while Appendix B will provide you with general information on drug-free workplace programs. After you have completed this training, sign the certificate of completion and give it to your DAPM or DER. He or she needs to retain documentation of supervisor reasonable suspicion training. Use the reasonable suspicion testing checklist to ensure that you have completed all steps prior to conducting a reasonable suspicion test. While you're not required to use this form, it will help you in expediting the reasonable suspicion testing process correctly. The reasonable suspicion recording form is used to record the short-term indicators that lead you to your decision to conduct reasonable suspicion testing. These indicators include specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations based on an individual's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. The failure to complete testing form needs to be filled out when reasonable suspicion testing cannot be conducted within the mandatory time limits. If you cannot for any reason complete reasonable suspicion alcohol testing within 2 hours, you must document why on this form. If you cannot complete reasonable suspicion alcohol testing within 8 hours, you must also document why on this form and discontinue the testing process. The Federal Test Notification and Authorization Form can be used to keep a written record of notifying an employee that a reasonable suspicion test is required. Fill out the appropriate information pertaining to the test and provide the employee with a copy to bring to the testing site. Please call us at 1-800-253-5506 if you need additional forms. Please take a few minutes to use the knowledge you have gained in this training and think about the following scenarios. Turn to the What If Scenarios section of the workbook now. For each scenario, you'll find space to write in your own determination on how to handle the situation for each of the 6 steps of reasonable suspicion. This will also give you additional information to use as a reference later. Stop the tape and complete your answer. Discuss the situation with other supervisors who may be completing this training with you. Then, restart the video to check the answer and see how you did. Stop the tape now and fill in your answer for each of the 6 steps in the workbook. When you think your answer is complete, restart the video to see how you did. You own a propane company in a small town. You are the only propane provider in the region, so if you're short-handed, your customers really suffer. You do your best to hire good drivers and send them for random testing as required. You believe that none of your drivers use drugs and that they only consume alcohol during non-work hours. It's winter, and many of your drivers have come down with the flu. You had assumed that William had the flu because you noticed him sniffling. You now notice that he is also acting extremely hyper and is far more talkative than normal. You notice a white powder-like substance under his nose. He doesn't smell like alcohol, but based on your observations, you believe he is impaired. What would you do? Answer 1. In this scenario, you have made all the necessary observations for reasonable suspicion testing. Specific, sniffling, hyper, talkative. Contemporaneous, the behavior is occurring now, and the observations are articulable. You can put them into words. He was sniffling, hyper, talkative, had a white powder-like substance. The indicators, however, do not point to alcohol. In this scenario, you should remove William from safety-sensitive duties and take him to a private area. Since you do not believe that William is impaired by alcohol, inform him that you are taking him for a drug test. Base the confrontation on the documentation you have compiled. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed them in this scenario. Scenario 2. What would you do? Two of your drivers, Michael and Ken, don't always see eye to eye. You've had to break up arguments between them before. Their arguments tend to be over sports teams rather than work-related issues. Michael is a big New York Yankees fan, and Ken is a diehard Boston Red Sox fan. You yourself like the Yankees, and you think Michael has good taste. Michael tells you that Ken has a drinking problem, and that he has witnessed Ken drinking on the job. Michael has worked for you for a long time. You trust Michael, but you can't recall any incidents of Ken acting impaired. What would you do? Answer 2. In this scenario, you're not observing anything to indicate the individual is impaired, so you wouldn't send him for a reasonable suspicion test. The information you received is rumor or hearsay, which cannot be used for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing. Document the information that was reported to you, as you would document long-term indicators, to support any future decisions you may make when short-term indicators are in place. Short-term indicators must be in place to conduct reasonable suspicion testing. However, documenting rumor, hearsay information, and long-term indicators can help back up your decisions and will provide a record of the situations leading to the reasonable suspicion test, if one becomes necessary. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the documentation step in this scenario. Scenario 3. What would you do? Upon arriving for work, Scott normally clocks in and gets a cup of coffee in the break room every morning. You and Scott usually spend a few minutes talking about the latest movies until Scott leaves on his driving assignment. Today, Scott didn't come to the break room. You notice Scott has punched in and is on duty. You later observe Scott staggering, slurring his words, and smelling like alcohol. What would you do? Answer 3. In this scenario, you are observing specific, contemporaneous, happening right now, and articulable observations based on the individual's appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors. Staggering, slurring his words, smelling like alcohol. Proceed with the necessary steps to conduct reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly follow them in this scenario. Scenario 4. What would you do? You have determined that Nick, one of your drivers, is impaired by alcohol. He is slurring his words and his eyes are glassy. He also smells like alcohol and can't stand up straight. You decide to take him for a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. It's late at night and the testing site you normally use is closed. You call another site. That site is open, but they do not have the necessary equipment available for testing. What would you do? Answer 4. In this scenario, you need to find another testing site. Refer to the collection site information log that you filled out in the workbook for the numbers of all the sites your employer uses, even those after-hours sites. Remember, alcohol dissipates quickly, and you should not delay the testing until a testing site opens. If you still cannot locate a site, you need to contact your employer immediately for assistance in finding an appropriate testing facility. Don't give up. And don't forget about the mandatory 8-hour time limits for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the conduct step in this scenario. Scenario 5. What would you do? You observe Justin, a driver from another company, having trouble balancing. He has been reckless around sensitive equipment. In fact, you saw him smoking at the gas pump while he was filling up his truck. You go to talk to him and he is belligerent. You try to convince him not to drive, but he just becomes more belligerent. You call the company Justin works for and ask to talk to his supervisor. They say he is not available and they do not have another supervisor available. You feel that Justin would pose a serious danger if he gets back into his truck and on the road. You are trained to make reasonable suspicion determinations. What would you do? Answer 5. The DOT regulations state that only the supervisor of the driver or another supervisor at the driver's place of employment can conduct reasonable suspicion testing. See the interpretations of 49 CFR, Part 382.307, question number 3. You have taken the necessary precautions by attempting to contact the driver's supervisor. Since you feel the driver will be dangerous on the road and potentially cause an accident, you should call the police. Scenario 6. What would you do? Your ace driver Corey was just involved in an accident. He was transporting a shipment of lumber on Interstate 95 when another vehicle crossed into his lane, causing him to skid and then crash into the center median. Post-accident testing was not required under 49 CFR Part 382.303. The accident did not involve the loss of any human life, and Corey was not issued a citation for a moving traffic violation. The police on the scene did not suspect Corey to be under the influence of any drugs or alcohol. What would you do? Answer 6. In this scenario, you should observe your driver to determine if reasonable suspicion testing should be conducted. Because he has just been performing safety-sensitive functions, he is still, by regulation, considered to be performing a safety-sensitive function, and is subject to reasonable suspicion testing. Remember that police look for much higher alcohol levels than FEMSCA. You also know your driver better. If you believe he is impaired by alcohol, and your observations are specific, contemporaneous, and articulable, based on his appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors, you should conduct a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. If you determine testing is necessary, proceed. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly follow them in this scenario. Scenario 7. What would you do? Anthony's reasonable suspicion test result comes back with an alcohol concentration level of 0.025. He asks you to give him a break because he can't afford the lost pay if you take him off his shift. He points out that the other drivers aren't aware that he had been drinking and that he had been taken for an alcohol test. You're friendly with Anthony outside of work. His wife and your wife go shopping together, and his kids go to the same school as your kids. Anthony says if you let him go back to work, he'll be careful. What would you do? Answer 7. According to FEMSCA regulations, no driver tested for alcohol who is found to have an alcohol concentration of 0.02 or greater shall perform or continue to perform safety-sensitive functions. Also, an employer is not allowed to permit a driver with an alcohol concentration level of 0.02 or greater, but less than 0.04, to return to safety-sensitive functions until the start of the driver's next regularly scheduled shift, but not less than 24 hours after the test. Even though you're friends with Anthony, you cannot return him to his shift. While 0.02 isn't a violation that required the individual to undergo return to duty and follow-up testing, the individual is prohibited from performing safety-sensitive functions with an alcohol concentration of 0.02. Aside from what the regulations say, how would you feel if you let him come back to work and he got into an accident? Joe's birthday was on Sunday, yesterday. You and the other drivers went out for some drinks to celebrate. Joe drank at least 12 beers and did a bunch of Jell-O shots. You left around 6 p.m., but heard that Joe and the other drivers stayed at the bar until after midnight. Joe shows up for work at 7 a.m. Stayed at the bar until after midnight. Joe shows up for work at 7 a.m. He is sick to his stomach and barely able to function. He tells you that he has a hangover. What would you do? Answer 8. In this scenario, you would do nothing. The key here is hangover, not still drunk. As you recall from the video, chronic and withdrawal effects cannot be used for reasonable suspicion alcohol testing since alcohol is a legal substance and can be consumed during non-work hours. Chronic and withdrawal effects can be used for reasonable suspicion controlled substances testing since controlled substances are prohibited any time. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly follow them in this scenario. Scenario 9. What would you do? Stanley has been a driver for nearly 20 years. He has been taking night classes at a local community college and recently received his associate's degree in business. Because Stanley works so hard and went for additional schooling, you believe he has initiative and have promoted him from a driver to a supervisor of drivers. It's Stanley's first day in the position. Stanley will have other drivers now reporting to him. What would you do? Answer 9. In this scenario, you should immediately have Stanley complete reasonable suspicion training. The FEMSCA regulations clearly state that each employer shall ensure that all persons designated to supervise drivers receive at least 60 minutes of training on alcohol misuse and receive at least an additional 60 minutes of training on controlled substances use. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the prepare step in this scenario. Scenario 10. What would you do? You once considered Brian one of your best drivers. He put in long hours, covered for other drivers whenever you needed him to, and he took on the longest and toughest driving tasks. Brian was a careful driver and did his job well. However, over the past few weeks, Brian's work performance has been in decline. He now makes mistakes every day. He shows up late, takes extra long breaks, and has been sneaking out early. Recently, he's been calling out sick frequently. You don't notice any short-term indicators. What would you do? Answer 10. In this scenario, you are observing long-term indicators of either probable alcohol misuse or controlled substances use or both. Although you cannot use long-term indicators as a basis for reasonable suspicion testing, you should record your observations to support any future decisions you make. Document your observations and keep the documentation on hand in the event you conduct a reasonable suspicion test in the future. This documentation will support your decision and provide a record of the events leading to the test. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed the document step in this scenario. Scenario 11. What would you do? You've never known Dan to be a drinker. He never goes to happy hour, and at the company holiday party, he only drank ginger ale. Dan told you that he doesn't drink because his father is a diabetic, and he thought alcohol played a part in causing his father's health problems. You felt bad, but you conducted a reasonable suspicion alcohol test because Dan's eyes were glassy. He was slurring his words and acting lethargic. When the test comes back, it's negative. You still feel that something isn't quite right with Dan. You talk to him about the situation, and he agrees that he is not feeling well or acting like himself. You don't think Dan will be safe on the road. What would you do? Answer 11. Since you've expressed your concerns and feel that Dan would be a risk on the road, you should consider sending him for a medical evaluation. A medical evaluation will rule out the possibility of a health condition interfering with Dan's performance. Sometimes conditions such as low blood sugar can result in the same symptoms being exhibited as alcohol or drug use. Scenario 12. What would you do? A client calls and tells you that your driver Sammy appears to be impaired. Sammy drove into another truck, causing minor damage when he arrived at the client's site, and is dropping cargo as he unloads it from his truck. The client is a supervisor trained to make reasonable suspicion determinations and wants to send Sammy for an alcohol test. The client's site is 30 miles away. What would you do? Answer 12. According to the FEMSCA interpretations, only the driver's supervisor or another supervisor at the driver's place of employment can make a reasonable suspicion determination and conduct testing. In this scenario, since it's only a short distance away, you should go to the client's site and observe Sammy for yourself. If you reasonably suspect he is impaired and make specific, contemporaneous, and articulable observations based on his appearance, behavior, speech, and body odors firsthand, send him for a test. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed them in this scenario. Scenario 13. What would you do? Another client calls to tell you that your driver Fred appears to be impaired. Fred is one of your long-haul drivers. The client reported that Fred arrived at their location and has been stumbling around. The client told you that Fred fell out of his truck when he first got out of it. This client is also a supervisor trained to make reasonable suspicion determinations and wants to send Fred for an alcohol test. This client site is 3,000 miles away. What would you do? Answer 13. Again, according to regulation, a supervisor from another company cannot conduct reasonable suspicion testing on one of your drivers. In this scenario, since the client site is not a reasonable distance away, you should attempt to get Fred on the telephone. If you can get him on the phone, you can make a reasonable suspicion determination based on his speech. If his speech is slurred and you believe, based on your observation, that Fred is impaired, arrange transportation to and from a testing site for Fred. The client may be able to help you locate a testing site in their area. If he refuses to talk to you on the telephone or refuses to go for the test, consider taking disciplinary action or calling the police to have him taken off the road. With the exception of conducting reasonable suspicion testing, the client may also take actions to prevent the driver from getting back on the road. Please refer now to the standard procedures listed before the what-if scenarios in the workbook to see if you properly followed them in this scenario. This now concludes the video portion of our training. Please complete Part 1, the workbook, to meet the remaining portion of the 60-minute time requirement for reasonable suspicion alcohol training. You must view Tape 2 in this training package, Supervisor Reasonable Suspicion Controls Substances Testing, in order to complete your training requirements.